As you can see from the first slide, we're going to be talking about science and witchcraft, but I've got quotes around science. So that should tell you something about the kind of questions we're going to ask here, and I'm just going to do a very quick audience participation here, if my microphone will let me. I'm going to say a word, and I want you to tell me what immediately comes into your head when I've said it. Okay, bad luck in the front row. Science.
Knowledge.
Knowledge? Oh, okay, good. Okay, natural philosophy. Excellent, that's just what I wanted. It always spoils things when somebody comes up with a really good answer. Okay, that's good. I didn't plant them here, but that was exactly the kind of response we want. And the reason for me putting quotes around science is that that word hasn't always meant what we mean by it today. In fact, you're absolutely right. Originally, knowledge is what it meant. And in fact, it's in the whole ethos of UNSW, is scientia, which means knowledge. But since the times it meant that, it's changed considerably. And I used to get quite annoyed with students who answered test questions by saying things like, by the 20th century, medicine had become much more scientific. Because it hadn't. What had happened was the meaning of the word science had changed. So that's what I'm going to be looking at today. Where's the beginning of the word science, meaning more or less what we mean it today? Now, you can still talk about it as knowledge, of course you can. But the more common way of thinking the word science is a process. In other words, a way of doing things. That's how we tend to use it now. So certainly you could say to a certain extent it's a body of knowledge, but also it's a way of finding out something, a scientific way. We talk about the scientific method, which means, of course, that the body of knowledge is always changing. Something which sometimes gets people confused. They tend to think science, that's it, we've discovered something, nowhere to go with that one, we've found it all out. And anyone who says that is almost bound to be wrong, because that never happens. Okay, so we're going back to the 17th century. The other reason I thought this might be a useful lecture for you is that I notice in your assessment, you have an assessment called a professional at work. Now, I remember some girls coming and interviewing me last year until we discovered you weren't supposed to do it to somebody who was actually involved in the course, so they had to do it again. But this idea of interviewing a professional, somebody who does a job of work, what do they do? Why did they do that? Why did they pick that particular kind of work? Have they been successful? If so, why? That's a really interesting question. I've actually got a PhD student at the moment who's answering those very questions. He's talking about the history of specialism in medicine. And he's going around interviewing specialists in hospitals to discover why they picked up a particular speciality, and if they found that's what they wanted to do, are they stuck in something they really, really don't want to do? If so, how did that happen? Now, that's very helpful for you, for your future careers. I was just talking to somebody, a student the other day, who said, oh, I've been doing a year of something, and I really, really don't want to do it. It's terribly boring. And she said, oh, but it's such a waste. I've wasted a whole year. And I said to her, well, I mean, obviously that feels like that to you now. But in fact, it's better to discover now, after a year, that you're doing something you're not terribly interested in doing, rather than it being way down the track and you find that out. So part of this lecture today is looking at somebody that you'll think you have nothing in common with. But nevertheless, he picked a particular route. And because of that reason, picking a way of doing things, we're still talking about him today. You might like to think, will people still be talking about you in lectures in 500 years? Well, probably won't even have lectures in 500 years, but still. That's not bad to get people still talking about you at that period of time. What you've done is so influential, and this person is very much like that, but it could have been different. It could have all been very different. And we'll tuck in a bit of witchcraft at the end. Okay, so just to go back on what I said a little bit, here's just some pictures of what you might say illustrate scientific medicine in the 21st century. Microscopes, aseptic surgery, DNA, all the rest of it. That's kind of what we picture in our minds. But we also have what we call these days either alternative or sometimes complementary medicine. And we tend to not think of that as scientific. It's much more, not to be rude about it, obviously, but to be actually polite, it's much more sort of touchy-feely, personal kind of thing. Why the difference? There wasn't always such a difference between those two. And also, along the way, I'll be explaining what my volunteer here didn't really know what it was, natural philosophy. Why was I even asking him about that? And what's that got to do with anything we're talking about here? Okay, moving on. So medical science in the 17th century wasn't actually called medical science at all. It was actually usually referred to as natural philosophy. So you can see right away philosophy, what we call philosophy today, played a big part in this. You thought about things. Remember all the people we've heard, Hippocrates, Galen, they were all to a certain extent philosophers. Going even further back, Aristotle, Plato, people like that who also talked and wrote about medicine, they were philosophers. So a big part of medicine was thinking. So by the time we get to the 17th century, it's still called natural philosophy, and it's a very literate academic tradition of medicine, this kind of natural philosophy. You have to have been trained in philosophy, not just a question of thinking things. There's actually a course in it. So it's taught in universities, this natural philosophy, to men and boys. There was the occasional female practitioner later on, but not many of them. And basically the reason, as I've already explained to you, was not so much prejudice against women, but more the career trajectory simply didn't take in what women did. In other words, you had to be, as I've already said, able to speak Greek and Latin. You had to be able to go to university on your own, kind of live in a dormitory, as it were. Not the kind of thing that women in this period did. However, what some of them did do was inherit the medical practices of their fathers who had trained under this kind of regime. If they didn't have a son to inherit it, a lot of children died in those days, they wanted to keep it in the family so much that they were willing to pass it on to a daughter. That sounds very bad and very sexist, but nevertheless, that was the way people thought in those days, and it was a way for women to get into medicine. There were other ways, and we'll see them later on when we get further down the track here. Use classical languages, as I've already said, and it was very much based on the Hippocratic Galenic theory that we've already talked about. Here you can see an anatomy at one of the universities with probably not students. They look more like other professors who were, this is a very famous picture, I might say, staring at this man doing the anatomy. So a very high literate academic tradition of medicine bolstered up by thinking, natural philosophy. Okay, moving on. Here's the person I'm going to talk about. As I say, somebody you'd think, what on earth would I have in common with him? Well, for a start, he lived in, as you can see, the period, 16th, 17th century. There's a picture of him not looking terribly interesting, and I would have to say he wasn't actually a very interesting person. But what he did was interesting. He was actually very taciturn, didn't speak very much. People found it hard to get on with him, as it were. But nevertheless, what he did was so important, we're still talking about him now. What did he do? Well, he was an anatomical student. He was actually quite, despite the fact he was a bit of a boring person, nevertheless, he obviously had a bit of a spirit of adventure, because he lived in the UK, he lived near London, but he took himself off to Europe to train there. That was quite adventurous, really. He knew that Padua was the university to go to. Remember, the University of Vesalius, where he did all his anatomical work. He wanted to get the best training going, the best qualification. So, despite the fact he didn't speak, well, he did. He spoke a bit of classical languages, maybe wasn't so tremendously good at it, but he was prepared to learn. He was prepared to really slog at this. Here's a picture of one. I think that is actually the anatomical theatre in Padua. I showed you that last time, where the students got their training. So he studied anatomy in Padua, as well as, of course, the whole natural philosophy thing as well. And what did he do with it? Well, he actually did very well initially. Here's a picture of him. That's him. That's King Charles I in England, a bit later on, after he left Padua. Why is there a picture of him with the king? Well, he became a very high-status physician in St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London. Unbelievably, St. Bartholomew's Hospital is still there in London, called Bart's, quite a prestigious hospital to go to get training. It was founded several hundred years before Harvey, and it's still there today, so a very old institution. And notice he became a high-status physician there because of his good qualifications. They didn't just take anybody. They knew he'd been to Padua, so he would know the stuff, as it were. And even more than that, he became physician to the king. And by this time, you'd think it would be a bit safer. You wouldn't actually be put to death if you didn't treat them properly or if they died. Well, you might have thought so, but actually, as it turned out, this was one of his few mistakes, although, of course, he didn't know that at the time. Charles I wasn't actually the person to be associated with, because very unfortunately, the Civil War broke out not long after that, and Charles I was put to death. So what did Harvey have to do? He had to keep a very low profile. So he wasn't slung into prison as well, and he did that very well. Obviously a cautious, careful man. And he had plenty to do. He got on with his work. What's his work? Well, this was his work. Maybe not a very familiar title, but you'll certainly know about what he did. He published a book in Latin, of course, because he was a classical physician, called De Motu Cordis et Sanguinis in Latin. What that means is about the movement of the heart and the blood. Notice, not just about the heart and the blood, about the movement of the heart and the blood. That was the new bit. Unbelievably, and you'll find this hard to believe living in 2016 when it's publish or perish and you have to publish very quickly before somebody gets ahead of you with a discovery, Harvey actually didn't publish his work until 1628, many years after he'd actually done this as lectures. He did lectures, I think it was at Cambridge, to students. And the work that he did for these lectures, he eventually published, but about 10 years later. Things didn't move quite so fast in those days. However, this was absolutely and utterly groundbreaking work. Although, strangely, it took a little while to seep through people's consciousness, mainly because there was so much political turmoil in the country at the time, and Harvey was sensibly keeping quite a low profile. Nevertheless, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see this absolutely fits into our notion of the scientific method. And this is basically where we see it starting, where we see a separation from the natural philosophy, the thinking, and the science, the doing. Literally, he did things. What did he do? Well, here's what he did. He was later referred to, many centuries later, he was referred to as a true scientific investigator. That was a very, very flattering phrase to use. Why was he called that, though? Why wasn't he called a very, very good natural philosopher? That would have been much more in keeping with his time. And incidentally, here's a cover of his published lectures, the Anatomica de Motu Cordis et Sanguinis in Animalia, done on animals, as we'll see in a moment. That's the word, done, not thought about. Well, of course he thought about it, but then he did. So what did he do? All right, he started by thinking. Fair enough. Just exactly the way we do in science today. You postulate something. Could something be? You're going to start with an idea, otherwise what are you going to do? So he thought to himself. He postulated a circulatory movement of the blood. You might think, well, haven't people already done that? What about all these anatomies that people had done? No, Not really. The reason why they hadn't postulated it was Galen, remember him? The one who would have clamped down on any other thinking. He had said that the blood in the body does a sort of washing backwards and forwards, a bit like waves. Washing up, washing down. I mean, he didn't really explain how that happened, obviously. I mean, logically, you'd think it would all go down to your feet, and then how would it come back up again? So it's not a very logical thought. But nevertheless, they had to explain movement somehow, and this was the best way they could do it. Nuts, says Harvey. And to be fair, this wasn't an entirely original thought. The idea had come from some of his professors at Padua. But here's how it shows it's not the idea itself, it's what you do with it. And he was the one who went ahead and done something. Later on, some of his professors got very, very cross that he said he'd pinched their ideas, but they'd never published on it. They hadn't really said very much about this, so he got in with it, and he wasn't even very quick, so there you are. What else did he do that was new? Well, he based his findings on vivisection. A horrible word by the time the 19th and 20th and 21st century came around, but nobody was too fussed then. Please be quite clear, and I did get confusion in this one year when I didn't explain it properly. Vivisection is not anatomizing live human bodies. It really isn't. It's anatomizing, still awful, live animal bodies. But Harvey reasoned, in this particular time when nobody was that fussed about, you know, what happened to animals anyway, that he could only do his experiments, on warm and cold-blooded creatures where you could see the blood moving. If you couldn't see it, it was back to the natural philosophy. You just had to think about it. He wanted to see it. Warm and cold-blooded, because warm-blooded creatures, blood moves a bit faster, cold-blooded creatures a bit slower, so they were actually better because you could see the movement more clearly. What else did he do? He set up the notion of repeatable experiments. Scientific method again. An experiment isn't an experiment unless you can write it up and somebody can copy it and get much the same results. Otherwise, you might just have made it up, mightn't you? I mean, there's nothing to say it was real. So it has to be recorded and it has to be repeatable. This was what Harvey said. And even more revolutionary, perhaps, he refuted Galen. He said, sorry, but Galen was actually wrong, mainly due to the fact he never looked at this properly. He said there were no tides in the blood, and Galen's other rationalization for how the blood got from one side of the body to the other, for example, was he claimed there were holes in the septum of the heart. Now, I don't know if any of you did this at school when somebody brought along a pig's heart or something to have a look at. Did anybody have that in a science class? They used to do it. Maybe it's, you know, not good for pigs or something these days. Anyway, one way of looking at this was that you looked at a heart, and it very often was a pig's heart because pigs' interiors are not that different from humans. Galen looked at the pig's heart, and he thought, okay, blood gets from one side to the other. How does it do that? The septum, the big muscle that goes down the middle of the heart. It's true. If you look at it closely in some situations, there are little indentations. That's it, said Galen. But indentations, you can't actually poke anything through it. Said Galen. He always had an answer for everything. I'm looking at a dead heart, aren't I? Of course, the holes have closed up. If it was a living heart, of course you would be able to do that. You would be able to see it quite easily. So he was saying a dead body is different from a living body, which of course is true. But of course it wasn't true that the holes in the heart closed up. That was what he thought. It wasn't as a result of an experiment. So in his book, Harvey says all of this, pretty revolutionary stuff. What has he actually seen to prove this? Well, he's done some investigations. The most famous one is illustrated here. In fact, I wanted to bring a colleague along with me today, but he wouldn't come. because he has wonderful veins in his arms. And you can see it really, really clearly where the valves are. I've never seen it so clearly. It's amazing. But he wouldn't come and be a guinea pig, so sorry about that. You'll just have to imagine this, or look at your own if you like. What Harvey was on about was valves in the veins. He said, this is why you get a circulatory movement. It can't be backwards and forwards, because if you push the blood, and this is what this experiment's showing, you actually need a tourniquet around your arm. You then, you know, like they do when they're taking blood or they want to give you, you pump your hand so that you can see the veins sticking up. And you then push the blood down one way. And you'll see at various it looks as if there's little knots where it kind of stops. Won't go any further. That's the valves, because the valves will only open one way. So Harvey says, very quick explanation of this, you can look it up, it's a very, very famous experiment. And in fact, it had been shown at Padua before he left. But again, he used it for his work. He publicized it. In his book, they actually had a diagram of it, which was quite unusual for those days. So, no, blood can't go backwards. It can't go back where it came from. It has, because the valves won't let it. It has to keep going. He's shown that. He did have to do a postulation. This one he couldn't completely prove. He said there have to be little blood vessels, capillaries, so small that we can't actually see it with the naked eye. But they have to be there to join up the main blood vessels. Otherwise, my system's not going to work. And it must work, he said. He was so sure that this was right. And look at what he was doing. He was doing it without a microscope. He was doing it just with his own vision and just his own senses. And you might say, well, why on earth didn't he use a microscope? Well, two very good reasons. One is they hadn't been invented yet. They hadn't been invented until later, much later in the 17th century. We'll talk about that in a later lecture. But secondly, and much more importantly for Harvey, he thought if you were looking at a living body of the animals, you had to look at it with your own human senses, not some artificial instrument that would come in between you and your findings. So he was a bit philosophical, there's no doubt about it. Mind you, he was stuck with that anyway because he didn't have a microscope, so there wasn't much choice. So he did this on his animals. The animals were live. We would think now that this was extremely cruel, because certainly you had to do things that must have plainly hurt them. There was actually a film made, I think it was in the 1920s or 30s, reproducing Harvey's experiments on live animals. Nobody seemed to blink an eyelid about that in that period, but now, of course, that would be completely unethical, and there's absolutely no way you could do it. So if you see them at all, they tend to be done by diagrams, in a kind of diagrammatic form. Nobody in the 17th century was that worried about the welfare of animals. That came very late, not till the 19th and 20th century. And we might say, well, were they just heartless? Were they cruel? Were they horrible? No. They all had pets. Nearly everybody had a pet. People rode horses. I mean, where would they go if they didn't ride a horse? Nowhere. You had to have animals for food. Of course you did. But the prevailing thought, and here we come back to natural philosophy, of course, is that animals were brutes. And that doesn't mean they were awful and fierce. It meant they were a different kind of body. They didn't have souls like human beings did. So certainly God's creation, but a different kind of creation. So this is the way they justified it, whether realistically or not. Anyway, whatever. Harvey was looked on by future physicians as an experimenter. He was the first one who actually proved his ideas by experimenting. And from now on, that becomes what you might call the gold standard for putting forward your ideas in science and medical science. Very difficult to get people to believe you if you just say, well, I sat in my room and I thought about it a bit and I read some books and, you know, no, you've got to have done something. So he wasn't a speculator. He didn't just speculate. Well, he did to begin with, but then he went that step further and did stuff. That's why he was so well thought of. So, very quickly, just finishing off on Harvey. Was he a Hippocratic? Was he a Galenic? Was he a Vesalian? He actually wasn't as modern as we might like to think. He was a natural philosopher as well, because he talked about cycles in nature. So he was a bit Hippocratic. He said the blood circulates just as there are cycles in nature, like the seasons circulate, like the planets move around, all of that kind of thing. The body, the microcosm, emulates the macrocosm, the world and the universe, in as much as they knew about it, of course. So he was a bit mystical in that. He also talked about the heart being the innate heat of the body. So again, that was a bit Hippocratic. Remember about the blood, too much blood, you get very red in the face, you get all excitable. He said the heart was like the sun, the heat, or like a fireplace in a house. And that's why when the heart stopped, the body died. And everybody knew, of course, a dead body was cold, a live body was warm. Heart stops, all very logical. He also, before the king was actually executed, he thought he'd better be a bit diplomatic. And he actually had the king as his patron. And he dedicated the book to the king. Always a good thing to do. Picked the wrong king here, but he didn't know that. It's good to have somebody in power who will look after you in case you get anybody disagreeing with you. Because we all know from people like Galileo, disagreeing about science in those days meant you were probably put in prison, if not actually put to death. So it wasn't just a question of having a nice argument in the learned journals. You were likely to maybe not do so well out of that. So get the king as your patron. That saves you. Also, of course, he provides money. A bit like getting grants these days. No grants available from the government, but the king or some noble person with a lot of money will support you. And that means they get the reflected glory of all your findings, and they look good, and you get the money, because otherwise where are you going to get the money to do things? So this is what Harvey did. And also he had a bit of teleology. The ultimate reason for all things is that it is right to be so. That's actually a quote from the book. And it's almost straight from Galen. Things work because they work because they work. And later on they work because God made them that way. So anything that wasn't quite covered by his experiments, he kind of mopped up by that one. More or less, also, his investigation, as I've already said, was with his natural senses. So touch, feel, eyesight, hearing, all of that. I mean, he's got some quite heart-rending bits where he talks about, dogs and cats who are obviously in pain and the noises they make and things. It's quite tough reading. But of course, he looked on it as his investigations, as it were. However, having said all of that and talked up Harvey as your hero for the day, nevertheless, practical medicine was still Hippocratic Galenic. You went to the doctor, none of this blood circulation was going to make the slightest bit of difference to what he or possibly she said was the matter with you, and then decided what to do about it. Nothing in this made any difference until about the 19th century, because other things had to be put in place first. Nevertheless, it was a massive discovery. And not only that, as I said at the very beginning, it wasn't so much what was discovered, it was how it was discovered. So we're talking here about the beginnings of the scientific method and how you can legitimately claim to have discovered something. Legitimacy comes from doing it this way. Okay, very briefly, now we're going to look at another group who didn't do anything of the sort. Where did ordinary people go if they wanted somebody to tell them what was the matter with them? Well, they went to healers in the marketplace, just as they'd always done. This was the alternative magical medical approaches, known as the low tradition, rather rudely, but What that meant was it was generally a spoken tradition, it wasn't a literate tradition, and it was stuff passed on from person to person. So nothing to do with natural philosophy, nothing to do with experiments. It was grassroots healthcare, you might say. Still the basis of what's done in a lot of countries today, not all that different. It was often done in the marketplace. Here's a picture of some alternative healers who've set up in the marketplace. You see they've got a little stall stand here. Here's people listening to them. They're putting on a bit of a show, which is what they did to attract the attention of people. They'd sing, they'd do a bit of dancing. Then when people had come round, they would offer their medical wares, whatever they were. What were they? Well, they'd take your teeth out. If your teeth were hurting, that was really the only thing you could do if you had a sore tooth, was take it out. And most people were a bit cowardly about taking them out themselves. So they would pull it out. But they would also put on a bit of a show at the same time. So you had to put up with the audience laughing at you. But if you didn't mind that, then you get rid of your tooth. That's, of course, the origin of the dentists. Bone setters. If you had a dislocated shoulder, as we would say these days, your arms hanging by your side, you can see it even nowadays. If you're good at it, you can jerk it back into position. Or a finger that's dislocated, it hurts, but you can jerk it back. That's what the bone setters did. The origins of the orthopedic surgeons, although they don't like to think that, obviously. So again, they made it a bit of a show. People had to watch you. And finally, and of course this was how they made most of their money, they would sell pills and potions. That's what people really like. We still like that these days, don't we? In fact, there was research not so long ago that said just about everybody who goes to their general practitioner, particularly, wants to come away with a prescription. They feel really cheated if they haven't. So these people got onto that. They would sell pills and they would sell potions. Not for very much, because these were mainly poor people. So it was practical and cheap. You never saw anybody like Vesalius. You never saw anybody like William Harvey. They were away in the courts with the well-off people. Here was your medicine, your grassroots medicine. How did it all go so wrong? This is why the alternative medicine got a bad name for hundreds of years, unfortunately. A lot of the people who did this alternative medicine were women. Finally, we get to see some women. It was a good way of making some money. You could produce, looks a bit like the witches in Macbeth, but in fact, most women weren't putting eye of Newton, leg of toad, or whatever it is, into their potions. They were just putting herbal things in, mainly. So herbal cures were very common, and so was midwifery. Women who helped other women when they were pregnant and gave birth. Excellent services. Grassroots services that the doctors weren't prepared to do, and you could get them easily. Well, what on earth, you might say, could possibly go wrong about that? The last word up there tells you what went wrong. Wise women and midwives, herbal medicaments, excellent, big tick. Bad one, spells. That was where it all went wrong. Why did they need a spell? This was perfectly okay medicine. If the herbal stuff didn't help you, well, it certainly didn't hurt you. And a lot of the actual regular medicine did hurt you. It was because the spells were used as a selling point. It was marketing, a marketing approach. How were these women going to sell their medicaments, their pills and potions and medicines to other people? People would just think, well, I could go out into the fields myself and gather the this and that and the other and boil it up in my pot, and why would I pay somebody else to do that? Aha. They said, well, of course you could do that, but if you buy mine, and I'm not charging much for it, it has a spell attached. And what you have to do is take your medicine as the cock crows, I'm making this up, obviously, and say the spell at the same time. I mean, we might think, what? But it's not that different from saying, take your antibiotics 3 times a day, make sure you've taken some food, make sure you finish the course. It's almost the same kind of thing if you think of it in the same terms. People were convinced, of course they were. All you needed to hear was somebody saying, well, I got it from Mrs. So-and-so, and look at me, I'm fine again. And if it didn't work, you just said, oh, well, I must have taken it at the wrong time, exactly as you do with antibiotics now. So it was very successful. It was also very good to have women to help you when you were having a child. But it was the spells that got them into trouble. This was a period, as you've seen, because in Britain the king was executed. In Europe, everybody was fighting everybody else, as we saw with Pare last week. There was turmoil in the church and state. And it turned out that these women, in a bit of an unlikely way, turned out to be good scapegoats. Why is there such turmoil in society? Well, these women plainly are in league with the devil. Because women couldn't possibly, now everybody didn't say this, of course they didn't. It was like nowadays, most horrible things are a very, very small number of people. But if they're influential, it's the whispers, the French whispers thing. Things pass from person to person. Oh, if the witches are in league with the devil, does that mean they've got the devil to be in charge of our country instead of God? That would explain everything. Well, of course it didn't. But it was a good enough reason. Unfortunately, also, you can see here this Latin word, Malleus Maleficarum, a helpful book, a witch finder's book, written by a couple of religious men in the 15th century, beginning of the 16th century, how to catch a witch. And of course, it turned into a complete moral panic with fevered imaginations. Here's all the witches' familiars, rabbits, cats, exactly the same kind of thing as a woman would have in the countryside. Of course you would. But it was set up so that it was very difficult to prove yourself not a witch. That was the trouble. And sadly, we now know, for various reasons, some women actually did claim to be witches. As it turned out, it was quite a useful thing to claim to be. Why, you might think? Well, imagine you're a single woman, maybe a bit old, a bit like the ones that turn up in nursery rhymes, like the one in Hansel and Gretel and people like that, living in the wood. You're really at the mercy of anybody, perhaps the village louts who haven't got much to do on a Saturday night. Oh, let's let the animals out. Why don't we cut down all of her pear trees? What's going to stop them? What will stop them in their tracks is telling them that you're a witch. And if they're not very careful, you'll put a spell on their family. You might think, well, what happened when that didn't work? Well, in those days, somebody was always dying. So you simply pointed to them. It was very dangerous, very. The result? Well, the result wasn't good. Lots of trials, lots of tests for witches. There were lots of tests for witchcraft. But they always turned out that, of course, you were a witch because they were focused on proving that, plainly. And the punishment, the one that we hear most about was witches actually being burnt at the stake. Some of them were, but a lot of them were simply hanged because, quite frankly, it was quicker. So it wasn't good. Heresy, fear, and suppression came of this. But also, more from our point of view, the topic we're talking about, there was considerable rivalry with the physicians and the surgeons from these women. Because the ones who were the midwives had actually been surprisingly successful. Non-interventionist. Of course, occasionally mothers and babies died, but then they died anyway, particularly in this period. So, although it's difficult to prove, it would appear that at least some of the physicians and surgeons encouraged at least the harassment of the witches, if not actually putting them to death. At least stop them practicing from whatever they're doing, because, and we'll see this in a later lecture, by no coincidence whatsoever, men midwives grew up at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century, and of course they turned into obstetricians in the end. So men stepping into the space where women had been probably not a coincidence, although we certainly don't want to assume that they wanted all the witches burnt. Nevertheless, they got rid of them. So who were the most accessible healers? More rivalry. You really weren't going to go to London to have your, whatever it is, boils looked at by William Harvey. He wouldn't want to see you anyway, and in any case, he'd be way too expensive. So of course you just go to the local healer. And they tended, as I've said, to be non-interventionist, and so, as most things heal themselves, relatively successful. So, the sad outcome of this was that the grassroots medicine, not the medicine of the natural philosophy and Harvey and his experiments, but the medicine that was actually useful to ordinary people, was undermined. And it really went literally underground for many years. Later on, as we'll see in a later lecture, it came back again as alternative or complementary health care, but it got such a bad reputation that people were very tentative initially. In fact, in Australia, it was a lot of the Chinese healers who came in the gold rush period who actually enticed the settlers back into a different kind of medicine, because much to the horror of some of the doctors here, they turned out to be more successful. So patients will vote with their feet, but it did hit this for a long time. So we have to remember that when we're getting all enthusiastic about William Harvey and his circulation of the blood experiments. It didn't have much effect on ordinary medicine, although we'll see in a later lecture how it did later on.